Marked the 100th anniversary of the birth of Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a city bus in Alabama to a white man in December 1955. Her act of resistance led to a 13-month boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott, led by a young minister named Martin Luther King. In Washington, D.C. last month, President Obama presided over a ceremony unveiling a statue of Rosa Parks in the U.S. Capitol.
Rosa Parks' singular act of disobedience launched a movement. The tired feet of those who walked the dusty roads of Montgomery helped a nation see that to which it had once been blind. It is because of these men and women that I stand here today. It is because of them that our children grow up in a land more free and more fair, a land truer to its founding creed.
While Rosa Parks became a national civil rights icon, she was not the first woman in Montgomery to refuse to give up her seat on a city bus. On March 2nd, 1955, 9 months before Rosa Parks' arrest, a teenage schoolgirl named Claudette Colvin boarded a city bus after school to head home. As it filled up, a white woman was left standing, and the bus driver ordered the 15-year-old Colvin to get up and move to the back. She refused and was dragged off the bus in handcuffs. 3 weeks later, the New York Times ran an article headlined, "Negro Girl Convicted. She is held guilty of refusing to move to the back of the bus."
Claudette Colvin went on to become the star witness in a case that wound its way to the Supreme Court. The court eventually ordered an end to bus segregation in Alabama. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made his political debut fighting her arrest. Claudette Colvin joins us here in our studio now, 73 years old, living in the Bronx. And we're joined by Jean Theoharis, author of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Jean Theoharis is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College, has written extensively on the civil rights and black power movements, joined us in February on what would have been Rosa Parks' 100th birthday. Claudette Colvin. President Obama talked about Rosa Parks' singular act, but it wasn't exactly singular because you had done it before. 9 months before. She was 42. You were 15 years old. What gave you the courage that day? You were coming home from school?
Yes. What gave me the courage? All the unfair treatment that I had experienced in my early childhood. Plus, remember February, we celebrated Negro History Week, but our school did it for the whole month. So I had a whole month to talk about all the injustices.
Back in 55.
Back in 55, yes. So, I tell him, we had an instructor, her name is Geraldine Nesby. She refused to teach English. She taught literature. And Mrs. Joseph Lawrence, my history teacher, she taught us about Africa. And we learned about, through current events, we learned about Africa. And so I began to think, about all of this and how unfair we was treated.
And when the bus driver called in the police, they accused you of resisting arrest as well as refusing to give up your seat. Could you talk about that when the police came in to haul you off the bus?
One of the questions asked, why didn't you get up when the bus driver asked you, and the policeman? I said I could not move because history had me glued to the seat. And they say, how is that? I say, because it felt like soldier on the truth, hands were pushing me down on one shoulder, and Harriet Tubman, hands were pushing me down on another shoulder. And I could not move. And I yelled out, it's my constitutional rights. Because I wasn't breaking the law under the state's law, separate but equal. I was sitting in the area that was reserved for black pensioners. At that time, we didn't even want to be called black because black had a negative connotation. We were called colors. So I was sitting in the color section. But because of Jim Crow law, the bus driver had police force. He could ask you to get up. And the problem was that the white woman that was standing near me, she wasn't an elderly white woman. She was a young white woman. She had a whole seat to sit down by opposite me in the opposite row, but she refused to sit down because of Jim Crow laws. A white person couldn't sit opposite a colored person. And a white person had to sit in front of you. The purpose was to make white people feel superior and colored people feel inferior.
And this is something you clearly understood at the age of 15.
Oh, sure, because I didn't have to prepare for it. You learn it. I learned it at a very early age. My first encounter was in a general store when a little white boy and a little white kid about my age and his friends, relatives, came into the store and they were laughing about me. And the little boy to another little child said, "Hold up your hands, let me see, let me see." And I held up my hands to his hand. And my mother gave me a backhand slap on the forehead.
And the context of what was happening at the time in terms of the terror on the black community, there was a schoolmate of yours who was arrested for supposedly raping a white woman who was then later executed?
Yes, his name was Jeremiah Rees. They had him arrested, but he was tried for being a serial rapist of 6 white women during the summer.
So the police come March 2nd,
Yes.
1955. You're refusing to get up. When they come on the bus, what do they do to you?
Well, they asked me to get up, and I refused. And one of the policemen was a traffic policeman. He at Court Square, and he yelled to the bus motorman that he had no jurisdiction here, and he got off. So the bus driver moved the bus to Bibb and Commerce, and then 2 squad car policemen come on the bus, and I became more defiant. When they asked me the same question, and they yelled, "Gal, why are you sitting there?" I said, "It's my constitutional, I pay my fare, it's my constitutional rights." And he said, "Constitutional rights," and then one kicked at me, and he knocked the books out of my hand, out of my lap. And then one grabbed one arm and one grabbed the other, and they manhandled me off the bus. And after I got in the squad car, they handcuffed me through the window and took me to booking, and then not to a juvenile facility, but to an adult jail. And I stayed in jail approximately 3 hours until my pastor, Reverend H.H. Johnson, and my mother came and bailed me out.
Were you afraid?
No, I wasn't afraid. I was a teenager.
You were in the NAACP?
Not at that time. I wasn't in it. When I got arrested, I was in. E.D. Nixon is like our Al Sharpton, and I was introduced. He introduced Mrs. Parks to my family. That's how I learned about Mrs. Parks, through E.D. Nixon.
And he was president of the local NAACP, and she the secretary?
I don't know. I think he was in charge of the Pullman Porters.
Mm-hmm.
Ah.
And
the reaction of your parents, your family, to your arrest?
They knew about how I felt, because since Mrs. Joseph Lawrence was teaching us about Africa, I went to school with my hair in braids. And at that time, you had to do the best you could do with a hot comb and pomade. So I said, why put yourself through that trouble? So when I went to school like that, they said, "Oh, I was crazy, and that I would lose my boyfriend."
Ah. So this happened March 2nd, 1955. It
Yes.
would be 9 months before Rosa Parks would sit down on the bus and do exactly the same thing.
Yes.
That kicked off this kind of magic moment that kicks off the bus boycott. Why didn't that happen on March 2nd when you engaged in the same act?
I do not know. I wasn't. My parents wasn't involved in the MIA. I do not
The
know.
Montgomery Improvement Association.
Yes, I don't know, but they thought that I would not make a good test case. I know what was written in Taylor Branch's book, Part in the Waters, and what the attorneys had said, that later I became pregnant, but I was not pregnant on March the 2nd. And Mary Louise Smith Ware, they said her father was a drunk, alcoholic, but Mary Louise Smith went to a private school, St. Jude. She graduated from St. Jude.
And she was? Who was she?
She was only one of the plaintiffs. She
What?
was arrested in October.
Let's bring Jean Theo Harrison to this conversation, who wrote the book this past year, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Can you put Claudette Colvin's remarkably brave act, 15-year-old schoolgirl, into this larger political context? Why one action gets a lot of attention in Montgomery, but doesn't launch the boycott, and yet Rosa Parks does, and even the other young woman that Claudette Colvin was just talking about.
Right. So this is 1955. We're after the Brown decision. So this is a new legal moment. And
Explain the Brown.
Brown versus Board of Education. It's May 1954. The Supreme Court rules that school segregation is illegal, that separate cannot be equal. Shortly after that, Joanne Robinson, she's a professor at Alabama State College. She's also the head of the Women's Political Council, writes a letter to the bus company saying, if you don't change, we're going to boycott. So we are in a new moment in Montgomery. There had been people before 1954 that had resisted on the bus. There had been particularly more people in the decades since World War II. But 1954, we're in a new moment. The Women's Political Council had been organizing. The NAACP, E.D. Nixon and Rosa Parks in particular are the more activist part of the NAACP. They are growing frustrated with the continuing situation, both on the bus and then in schools in Montgomery. So then, March 1955, Claudette Colvin makes her historic act, and there is outrage in the community. I think there's no way to understand why people galvanize behind Parks without understanding Colvin's arrest and what that does for many people in Montgomery. So no, we do not see a movement. We do not see, that same kind of reaction. But had Colvin not made that stand, I don't think we would have necessarily seen what happened in December of that year. And then, midway through in October, like we were talking about, Mary Louise Smith makes a similar stand. Again, there is no movement around that. And then we get to December 1st, 1955.
So in effect, then, these earlier incidents sort of convinced Parks and Dixon that at the time was ripe to make a symbolic stand, refusing the bus and to sit in the back of the bus, and then start the boycott as a result of that new arrest.
Yes, and there are these meetings of civil rights leaders over the summer with the city around bus segregation. Promises are made. Interestingly, Rosa Parks refuses to attend those meetings. She's done. She says, I'm not going to, come to city officials with a paper in hand asking for my rights. But other civil rights leaders in the community do meet with bus officials. There are promises made. The city makes promises. Those promises are not kept. So many people, again, in December, when Parks makes her stand, are also very aware that promises have been broken. And if you look at the leaflet that circulates, right, that calls for the one-day boycott, that leaflet very much locates Parks's stand in this broader history of Colvin's stand.
In fact, interestingly, the historian Douglas Brinkley has written that the delay between Claudette Colvin, our guest today, her act, and Parks' arrest allowed Dr. Martin Luther King to emerge as a leader. He most likely would not have led the bus boycott if it had occurred in the spring after Claudette Colvin's arrest instead of the following winter. Brinkley writes, he might have ended up as just another Montgomery preacher. We're going to hear what King has to say after break. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. On these last days of Women's History Month, we're joined by a woman who made history, Claudette Colvin. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.